Hello and happy and blessed, successful and healthy New Year 2022 to all of you from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. So this video is different from the ones that I usually post here on YouTube. It concerns this interesting book, which is partly a personal diary and partly also, we could say, a social science study comparing the 5 Nordic countries, meaning Finland, where the writer, Mrs. Anu Partanen, is from. She's a professional, experienced journalist and has been married since 2008 or 2009 to uh, let's see, Timothy Corson, who is an American writer and teacher. They lived in New York City, but then in 2018, after Mrs. Partanen had lived for 9 or 10 years in the United States, she immigrated at Christmas 2008. They decided to move to Finland. By that time, their first child, a daughter, had been born. And then Mrs. Partanen found a new journalistic work or media work in Finland. Or I'm sorry, Trevor Corson. Trevor Corson is the American-born husband of Mrs. Partanen. So why am I doing this video? Why am I filming myself again? Not for fun, no. But to those of you who want to realize what it is or what are some or several differences between the United States and the 5 Nordic countries. Sorry, I was distracted in finding the accurate name of the American-born spouse of Mrs. Partanen. Yeah, so Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. They often are called Scandinavian countries, although I, as a Finn, can kindly correct those if they want correction, who feel that Scandinavian and Nordic mean exactly the same thing. It's not exactly the same thing, because if we are precise, Scandinavian refers to Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. But then Nordic refers also, as far as the independent countries are concerned, to Finland, my distant native land, and Iceland. Mrs. Partanen is only a couple of years younger than myself. She was born in 1975, according to her Wikipedia biographies available in Finnish and English, while I was born in November 1972. So we are part of the members of the same generation, those born in the 1970s. I think it was in 2007 that Mrs. Partanen, then of course Miss Partanen, met Mr. Corson. They were in some international media gathering or similar event, and they quickly felt attracted to each other and fell in love by 2008. And then after months of weighing the pros and cons, Mrs. or Miss Partanen at the time came to the conclusion that it was easier for her, more convenient for her to immigrate to the United States than for Mr. Corson to immigrate to Finland. And I made a similar choice in 2014. I had got engaged with my wife in December 2013 while visiting the Philippines for the first time, or the second time, sorry. The first time had been in June 2013. And then I, as a globally minded individual, felt that it was more convenient for me to immigrate to the Philippines rather than for my wife to immigrate to Finland. And besides, I already had spent several years as an immigrant in Canada, to be precise, from 1987 to 1993. So I can relate to what Mrs. Partanen writes in this book. And one of the reasons why I recommend this book is that it's a carefully researched one. It's not a too outdated one yet. It was published in 2016. And it neither is a thoroughly anti American and pro Nordic book, nor a thoroughly pro American and anti Nordic book, but it tries to strike a fair balance. And in my opinion, she has done a commendable job and service to her readers, including myself, in trying to detail what are the main socio-economic and cultural, and to some extent political, strengths and weaknesses of both the United States and the five Nordic countries. The only major aspect of living in the United States as opposed to living in the Nordic countries that I, because of my personal Christian beliefs, would have wanted her to include is religion. Because as any seriously done, extensively done survey of the Western countries, meaning the European countries, Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, would indicate a considerably higher percentage of Americans than on average in the other 49 or so Western countries tell pollsters that religion is an important part of their lives, and a much higher percentage of Americans, according to the national and international opinion surveys, believe that or call themselves deeply religious, whether deeply Christians or deeply Christian believers, or then deeply committed members of other religions, than is the case elsewhere in the Western world, especially in the Nordic countries, which are not just among Europe's most secularized countries, but they are even among the world's most deeply secularized countries, alongside such European countries as Estonia, the Czech Republic, the Netherlands, and Belgium, for example. This, of course, doesn't mean that necessarily the private or public morality are at a considerably higher level, or at considerably higher levels in the United States than they are in the Nordic countries, as any serious survey of the extensive US mass media would tell us. And it's lamentable that according to numerous studies and opinion polls, we can find people who admit having committed sexually immoral acts, such as being unfaithful to their spouses by having sex with other women or men, or in some cases, sadly, even both. We can find surprisingly high percentages of especially men, but also of women in considerably religious communities, such as the fundamentalist, evangelical, Pentecostal, and charismatic Christian communities, and then other ones like the Orthodox Jewish or conservative Muslim communities, who have admitted, at least sometimes, having committed these sexually immoral acts or having had sex before marriage. So, as I said in the school year 2020 to 2021, to my students of what was then the grade 10 modern world history and contemporary global culture, global issues course, was that uh, that the United States is a less consistently secularized country than are the other Western countries, because there are so many more people who are, or at least claim to be, religious. And of course, the existence of those religious people, whether professing Christians or professing members of other religions, who want to take their religious or Christian activism to the political arena, the so called Christian right and the religious right. Those do exist in most other Western countries, including most European ones, but they are considerably weaker, apparently less encouraging or encouraged to keep fighting for their values and causes, and they receive considerably less media coverage, and they have considerably less direct political influence in most other Western countries than the Christian right and the religious right do in the United States. And also, the spectrum, whether it's the moral or ethical spectrum, religious spectrum, political, social, economic, cultural, race relations, or multicultural, or global citizenship, or um, or um, international versus patriotic citizenship, of course, or international versus nationalist perspective. Of course, the opposite of multicultural and global citizenship is patriotic. Regardless of which one of those spectrums you look at, and you compare the United States with most other Western countries, you can find that the extremes, in other words, the extreme conservatives or traditionalists, and then the extreme liberals or leftists or secularists, are much more prominent in the mass media and especially the social media than they are in most other Western countries. Why is that? Well, because the United States is one of the world's most individualistic countries. So do your own thing, do what feels good to you, and so forth. While those attitudes exist in most other countries of the world, including all other Western countries, still those attitudes are even more encouraged in the United States. And then also being good Christians or good other deeply religious people, loving one's country, one's church or other religious community, one's flag, one's family, you can find considerably more people who at least claim to be deeply committed to these values than in most other Western countries, as passionately committed to them. And then the United States is, even among the Western countries, probably the most media centered and media influenced countries on the face of the entire earth. Not the least because so much of the international or global publishing and broadcasting, whether radio, television, or internet, goes on in English. And most of the world's prestigious publishing companies have their global headquarters in the United States. Most of the world's influential global broadcasting networks have either their global headquarters or one of their main international headquarters in the United States. Most of the world's English language books are published in the United States, along with most of the world's English language newspapers and magazines, and probably even newsletters, and even online. The US influence is extensive, which doesn't mean, however, it doesn't mean that we should just study the US extensively in order to find out about the rest of the world or even the rest of the Western countries. That's not true. Because the US culture, and I'm so glad to the good Lord for the fact that in the 1990s, first briefly in 1993, and then from 1996 to 2000, off and on, I studied, although the active lessons were from 1996 to 1997, at least for the most part. I studied North American Studies, which is a multidisciplinary subject involving, for example, political science, economics, culture, literature, music, even road travel, ethno-racial relations, and so forth, involving the political systems and the cultures of Canada and the United States. And having lived in Canada for several years myself, and having also for many years since I returned to Finland in 1993 from Canada, spoken and read English extensively, and then listened to radio broadcasts from different countries, including Canada and the United States. And then nowadays on the internet, I readily read news from those countries as well, although mostly in French in order to improve my knowledge of that language because I'm also a French teacher. So, because of that, I feel at least somewhat qualified to review this book. You may, of course, disagree with my review, that's your right. But I hope and pray that you will politely appreciate this book review, even if you disagreed with it. So if I look at the table of contents, there's the prologue where Mrs. Partanen basically introduces the topic and why she has decided to compare the United States with the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. Then chapter 1, In the Land of the Free, Becoming American, where she talks about how she met her first boyfriend and then fiance, and then since either 2008 or 2009, her husband, Trevor Corson, and how she decided to give up her secure job as a journalist in the Helsinki region of Finland and vacate her apartment and then immigrate to the US at Christmas 2008. So that's one of the most personal chapters. And then eventually the book concludes with her becoming a US citizen in November 2013, having lived in the United States under 5 years, but since she had obtained already the green card, the permanent immigrant visa to the US, and was married to a native-born US citizen, of course, those factors helped, and also her fluency in English and having a regular job as a journalist. Then to the Nordic theory of love, Pippi Longstocking's magic. 3, family values for real, strong individuals form a beautiful team. 4, how children achieve secrets for attaining educational success. 5, healthy body, healthy mind, how universal healthcare could set you free. Then 6, of us, by us, and for us. Go ahead, ask what your country can do for you. Of course, that's the reverse of the late and tragically assassinated US President John Fitzgerald Kennedy's brief inaugural address's most memorable phrase, which he pronounced almost exactly 61 years ago on January the 20th, 1961. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Sorry for those who are able to impersonate the late President Kennedy better than I. But he seems to have had a somewhat nasal voice. Then chapter 7, The Lands of Opportunity, Bringing Back the American Dream. 8, Business as Usual, How to Run a Company in the 21st Century. 9, The Pursuit of Happiness, It's Time to Rethink Success. Then epilogue, acknowledgements, notes, bibliography, and index. It also includes an interesting interview behind the scenes of Mrs. Partanen. Oh yeah, the book tour actually. So this is actually a quite good summary of it. Sorry, Mrs. Partanen, if you're watching this video, it's not my intention to infringe on your copyrights, but just to inform the English-speaking public here on YouTube who want to learn to understand what exactly differentiates, in this case, the United States from the 5 Nordic countries below the surface. So she basically summarizes that she became acutely aware of the extensive differences between the United States and the 5 Nordic countries after immigrating to the United States. She also discovered that many Americans had misunderstood some of the main parts of the Nordic life. So considering them basically as socialist nanny states, although since the 1990s, all of the five Nordic countries have become considerably more free market oriented ones, without, however, abolishing such benefits of social democracy as universal healthcare, as the family allowance, as um, the disability pension, um, universal and either free or low cost access to healthcare, universal and free um, grade school education, meaning elementary and junior high school education, and then at least at most of the Nordic universities, the lack of tuition, at least for the uh, students, yeah, universities and colleges, at least for the students who are either citizens of those countries or regular residents, especially in those three Nordic countries which belong to that economic, political, and even partly military organization where most European countries belong, the European Union. And also, taxes have been reduced, especially taxes on unearned income from investments and so forth. So, actually, according to Mrs. Partanen, the Nordic people, or Scandinavians, if you prefer the term, are just as selfish as the world's other people, and they disagree with each other just as much as the world's other people do. And on the other hand, they can be just as generous as people elsewhere, including in the United States, can be. And I wholeheartedly agree with the statement that Americans need to understand that nowadays the Nordic countries are strongly free market oriented. I mean, I've lived in Finland long enough to know that, especially since the early years of this century, so roughly for the last 20 years or so, a growing number of Finns have regularly complained in the Finnish mass media that Finland has become a too harsh society, too neglecting towards the less fortunate people, the underclass, the unemployed, the elderly, the sick, chronically sick people, the homeless people. There are tens of thousands of either regularly or partly homeless people, even in Finland. Although most of them will find a temporary shelter during the still long and cold and snowy Finnish winters. And that Finland has supposedly become too much like the United States, regardless of the fact that Finland still has, for example, universal health insurance, which the United States still doesn't have, as the only advanced industrialized country on the face of the earth. And then, secondly, Finland still has family allowance for all the parents of children and teenagers aged under 16 years. And then Finland still has free uh, or low cost daycare, communal daycare provided for its children. And then Finland still has basically free uh, grade school or elementary and junior high school education. And Finland still doesn't charge um, at least the Finnish citizens and other EU citizens, and then the Norwegian and Icelandic citizens, I think, for the privilege of studying at, tuition payments for the privilege of studying at its universities and colleges. The non-EU citizens and non-Scandinavian or Nordic citizens may be charged, but I'm not sure about that. And Finland still has more generous publicly provided pension benefits than does the United States, and so do the other Nordic countries. And Finland still has, especially compared to the United States, a more progressive income tax system. 11 and 12 students at the. Okay, I hope and pray that this internet connection problem, okay, will be resolved and won't return. So despite the fact that nowadays the Nordic or Scandinavian countries are much more capitalist than they were still in the 1980s, during the last full decade of the Cold War, by the way, they have combined free market capitalism with a still comparatively generous network of social programs. And still, they are individualistic countries. Those extensive social programs are actually designed to make the individuals less dependent on their families and even on their spouses to make ends meet. So, one of the downsides in the United States of the lack of a Nordic or even European or Canadian or Australian or New Zealander type welfare state is that so many people are then dependent on their spouses or partners and families. In one of the chapters of this book, Mrs. Partanen even mentioned the so called boomerang kids. In other words, young adults in their 20s and early 30s who, because of financial reasons, have chosen to return to live with their parents. And also, a considerable minority of those young adults have never chosen to leave home in the first place. And also in this interview, which is available on pages 9 to 16 of the final part of the appendices um, about the author, the interviewer asked Mrs. Partanen if it was really reasonable to compare American and Nordic societies given the considerable cultural differences between the United States and the Nordic countries. Well, she corrected the mistake that she wanted to extol the alleged superiority of the Nordic culture, or we should use cultures, because none of the Nordic cultures is um, uniform, especially not now in the early 21st century, nor are the Nordic countries as a whole uniform culturally, definitely not. Um, so Mrs. Partanen stated, and I wholeheartedly agree with her, that there are negative and positive sides to both cultures, and of course, we should add to all human cultures. She just wanted to give the readers a thorough examination of these and comparison and contrast between these negative and positive sides of both the American culture, or I should actually say cultures, because in the United States there are literally people from all over the world. There are people from Canada, that second and, in my opinion, lamentably often ignored or belittled gigantic country to the north of the United States, then from Latin America, including Mexico and the Caribbean, and more are trying to migrate there, unfortunately, many of them illegally because of the socioeconomic, political, and other problems and medical problems in Central America and the Caribbean and Mexico. And some are even migrating from South America, that trek of thousands of kilometers across the narrow, uh, initially narrow Isthmus of Panama, and then into Mexico, and then all the way across the Mexican-U.S. border. And then there are people from Africa, literally born in Africa. There are people obviously from Europe. There are people from Asia, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, Filipinos, and so forth. There are also people from Oceania, not just Australians and New Zealanders, but also other Pacific Islanders like Fijians, Kiribatians, Vanuatuans, Tongans, and so forth. And, well, there may be even some people from the Antarctic, because after all, the Antarctic has, according to its English language Wikipedia article between 1,000 and 5,000 residents, depending on the season, and most of them are scientists, and of course, quite many of those scientists are either Americans or other Westerners. Um, and then Americans also have the misconception, at least according to Mrs. Partanen, that uh, Nordics can afford to have these universal social programs, contrary to the Americans, without the negatives of these policies, because in Nordic countries people work. In fact, when we measure the average working time, even of full-time employees, the difference is probably even more considerable if we include the part-timers. Then Americans on average work considerably longer hours per year than do the Nordics. Um, and then in the United States, many people oppose the welfare state as basically giving those who don't want to work or even study or try to find work a free ride. But the social benefits, as Mrs. Partanen skillfully points out in this carefully researched book, are considerably more meager than in the United States than in the Nordic countries. Besides, I would add, many of them are means tested. So you have to prove that you are too poor to live through private charity or your family's charity and so forth, and then you can qualify for these. Even the so-called Obamacare or Affordable Care Act that was passed by the US Congress in 2010 during the first term of the former US President Barack Obama, even that one leaves tens of millions of Americans out. And even if the Democrats were able to hold on to the White House after the 2024 US presidential elections, which is far from guaranteed, and even if there was, like for several terms into the future, starting from the first or only, depending on how life goes and how God ordains the matters, of the current US President Joe Biden. And even if the Democrats were able to recover, recapture, and then hold on to their majorities in both houses of Congress, especially holding on to them is doubtful. Even under those rosy scenarios for those who deeply are committed to the Obamacare, even then, the United States would not yet have a universal coverage in its health insurance, because in the Obamacare, there is a clause according to which the people can opt out of it. They are not required to get insured if they don't want to. So, as Mrs. Partanen points out in her book concerning comparing the universal health insurances of the 5 Nordic countries and then the hodgepodge, as she called it, of private and public sector health insurances of the United States, there are different types of health insurances in the United States, and it largely depends, of course, on how much money one has at his or her disposal in that country. And I'm not saying this because I want to bash the United States. I'm simply stating facts. So how much money a person has at his or her disposal, whether earned income through regular salaried work or unearned income through investments and property and so forth, or then savings, or then resources from one's family, financial resources, and then for whom one does work. Because the levels of health insurance provided by the American employers vary a lot. And then where one lives. Generally speaking, in the northern states of the United States, so if we cover them, Alaska, because it usually is dominated by the Republicans, probably has more meager health insurance and other social welfare benefits. But if we consider the northernmost states or the northern half states of the contiguous United States, so 48, the 48 federal states that are in the mainland North America, excluding, of course, um, Alaska and Hawaii, then generally speaking, especially in the Northeast, meaning New England, so Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and then some of the upper Midwestern states, Michigan, Wisconsin, um, and Minnesota among them, and maybe some of the northwestern states, Washington and Oregon, the healthcare and other social welfare benefits tend to be more generous. To some extent, in California, interestingly enough, California, at least at the time of her publishing this book, according to Mrs. Partanen, was, I think, the only US federal state or one of the few to have a state level guaranteed annual parental or family leave law. But even in California, those benefits as of 2016 were rather meager compared to what they would be in the Nordic countries. And then where are the health insurance benefits and other social benefits the most meager ones in the United States? Generally speaking, in the southern states. So going all the way from Arizona in southwestern United States to Florida in southeastern United States, although of course there are exceptions because after all, as some North Americans have put it jokingly, Florida is God's waiting room because so many retired people and retirees usually are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s, occasionally in their hundreds. Uh, well, they do need health insurance the most because of their physical decline and even in various cases emotional decline. And therefore, Florida might have somewhat more generous benefits than do its fellow southern states like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and New Mexico or Oklahoma. But generally speaking, in the Nordic countries, regardless of where you live, you have a right to accessible and affordable uh, public sector healthcare, especially in the acute cases where you are in the danger of losing your life or becoming disabled because of, for example, a sudden stroke, heart attack, diabetic shock, or insulin shock. Uh, if you have been stung life-threateningly by some insect, uh, you have some severe allergic reaction to some foodstuff and so forth, or if you are choking and in the danger of dying, um, or if you have cancer, for example, or you have an advanced case of heart disease, or as my dear late mother had an aggressive arthritis coupled with osteoporosis. She passed away in September 2010. God rest her soul. Then, in contrast to the United States, where this catastrophic health insurance is provided, but then later on, the survivors of those acute health crises, or then their loved ones, or friends, or philanthropists, or employers, have to pay uh, often horrendously high um, medical insurance bills or healthcare bills, treatment bills, hospital staying bills. In the Nordic countries, they cap or set, at least in the public sector, clinics and trauma centers and hospitals, they put an annual limit to the amount of money that the people, even those who are chronically sick and spend months on end in the hospital or frequently visited, um, have to pay. And I know this for a fact because my dear late mother, in her last years of life, often had to go to the hospital because of her multiple health problems, heart disease, and eventually the insufficient functioning of the heart, uh, and then her arthritis, her osteoporosis, and then, of course, the fact that, and tragically, the fact that she was also quite severely obese, and the fluid accumulation in her body because her heart wouldn't function properly, and in her last year of earthly life, 2010, also her diabetes and asthma. But this is something that most Americans can only dream of. Of course, the upper class Americans and their families, and then even some middle class Americans who have particularly generous employers and therefore extensively covered health insurances, they can get such affordable care even if they had chronic health conditions, but most Americans can't. And then there are two special groups of Americans: the legally poor ones who are living below the poverty line, covered by the Medicaid, and then the retirees, those people who are over 65 years old and are legal US citizens, who are covered by Medicare. They have moderate payments. And as in this book interview, Mrs. Partanen pointed out, most Americans can't imagine having the generous paid vacations, sick days, and parental leaves that Nordics routinely enjoy. But then, for those who believe that the Nordic social welfare systems encourage many people who would be physically and emotionally capable of working and who are even educated to work in various professions, not to actively look for work, I would just point out that because of the economic globalization that has considerably affected even the Nordic countries since the 1990s, if people who are capable of working intentionally decide not to work, then their social benefits after a while, especially after a year and a half or two, will become considerably smaller. Unless then they can claim that, for example, they can't afford their rent, uh, or if they have children as dependents. I can remember reading an article in, I think, the Helsinki Messages, because that's the literal translation of Helsingin Sanomat, Finland's most widely read daily newspaper, because in Helsinki itself is published, I think it's a free newspaper, so free of charge newspaper, called Helsingin Uutiset, which literally means Helsinki news. Anyway, according to this article, which I think I read online in 2013, there was one young man in his 20s at the time, Taavi, which is one of the Finnish equivalents of David, who said that he was still earning something like 1100 plus euros. That's more money in today's euros and, of course, in today's dollars per month without working. And he said that he wasn't motivated to look for work. Of course, there are such people anywhere on this planet, including even in the United States, where if one intentionally refuses to work and is perfectly capable of doing it, so physically, educationally, socially, and even emotionally, then his or her benefits are going to be meager. Uh, and then question about diversity. Well, of course, the United States is diverse because there are people in the United States literally from all over the world. And while the Nordic societies do have immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers from many other countries, uh, they do not have even nearly ethnically, racially, culturally, linguistically, or religiously diverse populations as does the United States. Uh, but nevertheless, since the 1990s, especially the Nordic countries have been becoming considerably more multicultural, especially Sweden, and to a smaller extent, or to smaller extents, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and even Iceland. But as Mrs. Partanen pointed out in this book interview, Sweden, at least at that time, was it in 2016 maybe, had more foreign-born residents as a percentage of its population or per capita than the United States as a whole. Uh, well, then, of course, there was the question about the political change, and especially nowadays when, unfortunately, particularly at the federal level, the United States has a deeply polarized political system where both major political parties, the currently governing Democrats, because the president, Joseph Biden, is from that party, and the main opposition party, the Republicans, are too beholden to their radical wings. The liberals to, I'm sorry, the Democrats to their liberal and left-wing elements, and then, or progressive Democrats, as they are also called, and the Republicans to their conservative and radical right wings. And Mrs. Partanen answered that change in the United States often starts locally, so in the cities, towns, and counties. That's true. That's also a feature of the US individualism and also of the US federal system of government. And then the military spending, obviously, since the United States is one of the two world's remaining superpowers, the other one is China. It spends a lot of money, not the least because it happens to be the leading member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that military and defensive alliance, most of whose members are European countries, and that was established in 1949 in the first years of the Cold War. And then during most of the rest of the Cold War, it was officially opposed by the Soviet-led military and defense alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. So as Mrs. Partanen stated that Americans collect far less taxes as a percentage of their GDP than do the Nordic countries. That's true, because the United States has this anti-tax mood and has a lot more meager network and more means-tested network of social programs. On the other hand, the United States, like many other countries, suffers from a huge federal or national deficit, budget deficit, and the United States is one of the many countries whose gross public debt or debts are already bigger than their gross domestic products. And that's also very sad. So the United States in the future, not the least because of its domestic political and socioeconomic problems, this is my addition, possibly will either reduce its ability to intervene in the international affairs, meaning militarily, of course, and then focus primarily on defense. Or then it will have to do something which is very unpopular globally, but especially in the United States, tax the rich individuals and corporations. Because you can be sure that if such a spending a tax bill is brought either before the United States Congress or before most of the US state legislatures, it will be vigorously and loudly opposed. And then this is interesting. What could Finland learn from the United States? So, for example, appreciating and understanding cultural diversity, I do agree, although sadly there are a significant minority of white Americans and, of course, Americans of other racial groups who are still more or less racist and or racially or ethnically prejudiced. And then supporting talented individuals, this is true. And then be a lot more relaxed socially. This is also true. And then being more polite, friendly, and helpful, even to strangers. So Finns have this tendency to be introverted on average. Of course, there are always exceptions. There are also introverted Americans. And then also this optimism. And then this creativity. Although this, I think I'm adding to what Mrs. Partanen is saying. And then, uh, well, the final question, if you think life is so much better in Finland, why have you chosen to live in the United States? Well, she answered simply because of love. And then also, she was excited by the huge area of the United States and its variable nature. And also, of course, uh, its encouragement to many people to pursue their dreams. That's true. But then the social benefits are more meager in the United States because of the much more individualistic philosophy, socioeconomic and political philosophy of that country. There's one issue, one argument that I have to take issue against, with all respect to Mrs. Partanen, who overall has written, I would say, an excellent book. I bought, when I was leaving for the Philippines after having spent several weeks in Finland during the summer of 2019, it was on July the 23rd at the Helsinki-Vantaa International Airport in Finland, so roughly 20 kilometers to the north of the center of Helsinki, the Finnish capital. I was looking for books about Finland. I was able to land on two books about the Nordic countries. This was one, and then the other one written by a British-born journalist based, at least as of the early 2010s, in Denmark, the southernmost of the five Nordic countries, Michael Booth, but that was a much worse written book. It contained too much what I consider distasteful humor, irrelevant details, and too many examples of what seemed to be one of his favorite pastimes back in the early 2010s, drinking. And since I don't drink alcohol myself because of both my Christian beliefs and because of matters of conscience, and then also because I want to give a positive example of how there are also sober Finns who are basically teetotalers. The last time I knowingly drank some alcohol was at a family gathering on New Year's Day 2016, so 6 years ago. So compared to that book, which was more for the people who love comedy, this book was a much more seriously written book, although it wasn't without its comical parts, obviously. So for the people who want to have at least a basic book of how exactly the United States differs from the five Nordic countries, this is one of the best books I have found, although I haven't done any extensive research. So this, I'm going to read one quotation. Sorry, Mrs. Partanen, if you're watching this, but I don't want to bash you, but I just want to indicate my opposition. The most plausible explanation for why Americans, and particularly working class Americans, although I would add a growing number of people worldwide, even here in the Philippines, which is socially and culturally still a considerably more conservative country than are especially most European countries, are not getting married anymore has nothing to do with lack of morals. I respectfully disagree with you, Mrs. Partanen, it does. Because so many people don't have a personal living relationship with God through Jesus Christ, and so many people don't believe in moral absolutes anymore concerning marriage and living together with members of the opposite sex. And nothing to do with government welfare programs. It comes from Jennifer M. Silva, a sociologist and author of Coming Up Short, Working Class Adulthood in an Age of Uncertainty. So Silva spent several years interviewing young working class Americans about their lives. So people floated from one short-term, low-paid job to another who were unable to afford the college education and so forth. Of course, those are related factors, but the deeper reasons are in the people's lack of a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ. This book I bought just 4 weeks after arriving to the Philippines. So on November the 28th, 2014, uh, in the main bookshop of one of the local malls or shopping centers here, Are We Living in the End Times, co-authored by the late Tim LaHaye, an American Baptist evangelist or pastor or preacher. I don't know what his official title was, and a student and teacher of the Bible's end time or eschatological prophecies, and also the co-author of that famous 12 part series, Left Behind, of which have been produced at least 3 movies, and Jerry B. Jenkins. So this edition is from 2011. Mr. LaHaye, I think, passed away in 2016. He was already something like 90 years old, or in his late 80s. And then these are very well chosen quotations from the book. First on page 370, sexual immorality, but this of course applies not just to the United States or even to the other Western countries. It applies to basically all the countries on the face of the earth to varying degrees. So many people want to practice sex whenever and in whatever ways they want to, and with whomever they want to. And especially since so much sexually charged content is available on the internet, it's no wonder that millions and millions of people all over the world literally gratify their sexual desires and lusts on the internet. And tragically, sexual immorality will still get considerably worse before the second coming of Jesus Christ, especially that part of the second coming when he will establish the millennial kingdom, God's 1,000 year kingdom and reign of peace on the earth. And then page 372, Mr. LaHaye confessed that he had counseled many married couples, and then he could state that the massive breakdown of marriage today has no greater single cause than selfishness. Well, interestingly enough, Mrs. Partanen did mention selfishness, but not in the same context. I assume that Mrs. Partanen is not a religious person, and she doesn't even pretend to be one, much like most Nordics are not religious, most Westerners as a whole are not religious, although then there's a partial variation from that general trend among the Americans. So this is the natural result of 2 generations, so dating back to the 1960s, of teaching children and youth, and now we could already talk about 2.5 generations, or 3 in some cases, to do your own thing and get all the gusto or zeal, enthusiasm out of your life you can. Thanks to selfishness, and this was written a decade ago, or slightly over 10 years ago, because this edition of the book was published in 2011. The divorce rate in the United States, so in or around 2010 or 2011, was at 41% for first marriages, in other words, roughly 2/5, 60% for second marriages, so roughly 3/5, and 73%, so almost 3/4, for third marriages. Research indicated at the time of writing this book or when Mr. LaHaye and Mr. Jenkins co-authored this book, that the drop in the divorce rate for first marriages from its high of 51% sometime in the late 2000s could be attributed to many couples choosing to violate God's laws by simply living together, avoiding a divorce when they split by never marrying in the first place. And then, I mean, this cohabitation is notably common in Canada, even among the heterosexual couples, in Europe, Finland included, in Australia and New Zealand, and increasingly also in Asia. I'm not sure about Africa. Probably also, I'm not sure about the native Oceanian countries like Fiji, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, Kiribati, Tonga, Nauru, and so forth, but I would assume more common than, let's say, still in the 1980s. In Latin America, largely because of the Western, especially American, cultural influences through movies, TV, soap operas, and so forth. And yes, even here in the Philippines, which is compared to the United States and the Nordic countries and most other Western countries, still a somewhat socially conservative country. Even here, a growing number of especially young Filipino couples or partners live together without getting married for years. So that weakness, or those weaknesses aside, not considering religion, which still is a considerably more noteworthy part of the American life, despite the fact that many Americans are deeply secular as well, and then claiming that the rise in the rates of those people who don't get married has nothing to do with lack of morals. Yes, it does. So aside from those two weaknesses, I highly recommend this book. And I hope and pray, of course, that Mrs. Partanen and her husband and daughter will soon become true believers in Jesus Christ, and that, of course, they will all have successful lives and careers and so forth. So this is the end of the book review. I wish you a happy and blessed and protected, safe, healthy, productive, and successful remainder of 2022. Bye-bye for the time being.